Meanwhile, according to reports, US President Joe Biden has authorized the redeployment of several hundred American troops into Somalia. This comes after former President Donald Trump ordered their withdrawal during his presidency. For more on this, we're joined by SABC News correspondent Nick Harper in Washington. Nick, thank you for being with us. So apparently this isn't official yet, but what seemingly is the Biden administration planning?
Well, at this stage, what we're hearing are unconfirmed reports coming from top officials within the US government speaking on a condition of anonymity, speaking to US media outlets about what is a plan that has been in the works for many months. They say that different government agencies have been talking about the possibility of returning to what has been a three-administration fight against al-Shabaab in Somalia. US troops have been there through three administrations, but were pulled out by Donald Trump. So this would be seen as a strategic U-turn in many ways. We have had a number of US troops within the country for the last year and a half since the end of Donald Trump's presidency, but they haven't remained there for long. So this would be more about deploying potentially hundreds of US troops to be stationed there on a permanent basis. It's not clear exactly how many would go, but some officials have quoted a figure of 450, and they could potentially be heading to Somalia within the coming weeks.
So the former president withdrew the majority of US forces. The same issue, you say, has been there all along. So why the change? Why the timing now?
Well, that's right. Yeah, Donald Trump withdrawing around 700 troops really in the last days of his presidency. He made that announcement in January 2021, beginning of last year, just before he left the White House. His decision at the time was based on the fact that he didn't want US troops in other countries, and he didn't feel that it was important for US troops to remain within Somalia. Since then, the rotation of US troops, and there's really only been several dozen, have been going on 8-week cycles, predominantly to train and interact with Somali troops. But US officials have been saying for some time that quite simply this has not been working well, that morale between the US troops and the Somali partners is at a low, and they're also seeing this as quite an expensive and inefficient way of running counter-terrorism operations in Somalia, that these troops are having to go in every few weeks and not bringing the wealth of experience that permanently deployed troops have to be able to use. So they're saying that really the situation needs to change, and that's why they've been speaking to other agencies here in the US, speaking to President Biden himself, and also they've headed to Somalia and Djibouti at the end of last year to carry out reconnaissance missions to see what could potentially be possible, because there is this real feeling that extremism is still rife in Somalia and that it could pose a threat to the United States. There have been foiled plots in the last year or so where al-Shabaab people have been trying to carry out plots against the United States. Those have been disrupted, but the US really seems to feel that in order to disrupt them properly and ensure that they have full oversight on what is taking place in Somalia, they need to have US troops permanently stationed within the country.
And apparently the plan is to target al-Shabaab leaders. Surely Joe Biden will be asked, there were still risks, according to some, in Afghanistan, but he withdrew troops from there. So will he be pushed to explain the difference in approach when it comes to two different countries?
Well, undoubtedly he will, and already reporters have been asking top officials as to why there is this change of strategy. And what they've been telling reporters so far is that they see the two countries in very different and stark terms. They believe that the Taliban in Afghanistan do not pose a direct threat to the United States, whereas al-Shabaab in Somalia do. When the US president withdrew the troops last August from Afghanistan, he said that terrorism had metastasized to other countries, that it was fermenting in places like Somalia and not in places like Afghanistan, that quite simply the war on terror had moved on in the 2 decades since the US initially went into Afghanistan. And you mentioned those al-Shabaab leaders as well. Yes, reports coming out that at the beginning of this month, the president signed off on effectively targeting a dozen suspected leaders of al-Shabaab. Officials saying they feel this is a more effective way to fight against al-Shabaab by looking for these suspects and then potentially carrying out drone strikes against them. That is something that they feel would be a better way of disrupting the organisation, but also keeping Americans safe.
All right, thank you very much. Very interesting. That was Nick Harper live from Washington, D.C.